So at the beginning of the book, she says, because you took my name, I refuse to put your name to pen, which, I love that so much. The guy was a dick. I think I've been saying chaos a lot this video, but I love chaotic reads. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Leandra the TBR0, and my goal is to slowly but surely lessen my physical TBR, one book at a time. It is a long journey, but I believe in myself, and if you're on the same journey, I believe in you too. I am really excited because this is a big video for me. One, it's my first video of 2023. It's also my 1-year anniversary as a booktuber. I've been making videos and content for an entire year, and I'm really proud of myself for sticking with it. And I just want to first thank everybody who's been with me on this journey, who has ever liked a video, commented, or subscribed to my channel in the last year. Whether you are a new or old follower, I really appreciate you. I can't wait to see what this year brings for me and what this year brings for booktubers in general, especially those who I also like to support. If you're a new booktuber or you're a booktuber who has simply been in the game longer than me at the same time as me and we just haven't connected, please let me know who you are so I can go support your channel as well, because I honestly love this entire community. It is so fun. Anyway, so because it's a big video, you would think I would have new content, but instead I'm playing a bit of catch up, what's new, and today is going to be my favorite reads of 2022. I unintentionally am pairing this quite well with my most disappointing reads video because I had 9 titles in that video, and I just so happened to have 9 titles in this one. I did end up having a brilliant year though. I read 96 books and 32 of them were 5-star reads, which is about obviously 33.33%, or how normal people say it, 1/3 of the books I read. It's really interesting. I wish I had the time and energy to highlight every single book that I did give a 5-star rating to, but instead I've decided to select my favorite book in each genre I read. I think I did read more than 9 genres technically this year, but I just ended up choosing 9 that I really want to highlight, that I really want to talk about again or for the first time, because a few of them were books that I only read in the last couple months. And I would love to see what your favorite books are when it comes to a particular genre as well. So yeah, I can't wait to get into it. Let's just get started. Like and subscribe. While science fiction isn't a genre I read too often, I do thoroughly like science fiction. I think the reason why I don't read it very often is because unfortunately it does tend to be kind of depressing. It's really visceral, especially because oftentimes being science fiction, it's a futuristic society, the earth is dying, there are certain horrible problems that have not been fixed in the 100, 200, 300 years in the future, since modern day. And it's usually kind of a sad time when I'm reading a science fiction book, but I do love them so much. For instance, I really loved Sea of Tranquility this past year. The year before, I read Something New Under the Sun, and those are books that are genuinely going to be thought-provoking, favorite books that I recommend constantly to people. But this year, my favorite science fiction book ended up being one that I read back in January, and that is Appleseed by Matt Bell. And to be honest, this is my favorite book of 2022. I took some time to really reflect on the 96 books I read, and Appleseed is it's such an epic book. I can't express how amazing and brilliant the mind of Matt Bell must be to have written this book. It crosses 3 different timelines. We have a very futuristic time where it's just like the earth is desolated. It's this crazy ice age. And we also have a kind of a near future situation where the earth is slowly dying, where you can see crops are failing, temperatures are rising, water is rising, climate is just more extreme, animals are dying out in mass extinction events. It's honestly a time where you don't want to be living in it, and it's very scary, the idea that it is kind of our near future in the next 100 years or so. And then we have a frontier American kind of timeline back in, if I can think of it, maybe the 1700s. I really can't remember specifically, but yeah, think of the frontier in regards to half of the United States is not the United States. Ohio is still very much a swamp land that has not been developed. So picture that. And so as these three timelines are going on, they slowly become intertwined with each other, which you wouldn't expect because they are hundreds of years apart, but it's just so beautifully written. It really, like, I think I cried during it, if I'm being honest, which isn't surprising because most science fiction books do make me cry. And just the idea of Appleseed, the apples are consistently images that come up throughout the entire book, because the earliest timeline, you know, during the time of the frontier, think Johnny Appleseed, back in those days, it was actually illegal for you to plant an apple orchard, and that was your way of claiming land. And so that's kind of the beginning, this idea of apples being used to set civilization up, and then just slowly civilization ends up just destroying all of creation. And yeah, oh gosh, even just the creation story that's involved in here, I can't. I probably am botching this so much, but it is such an impactful read. Honestly, if it hasn't already sold you, the names on the back of this book that demonstrate how powerful it is, we've got Karen Russell. She's the author of Orange World and Other Stories, Swamplandia, and a few other collections. We've got Stephen Graham Jones. He's the author of The Only Good Indians, which is on my shelf, haven't read it yet. Kelly Link, who wrote Get in Trouble and Stranger Things Happen, I believe it's called. I have that collection up here. We have just so many well-known authors praising this book for good reason. This was my favorite book in 2022. And if I could even read one more book that's half as impactful as this one in 2023, oh my gosh, what a year that will be. It's so good. I love it so much. My favorite book among the horror genre was A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This was one of 6 horror books I read this year. I read 3 adult and 3 middle grade, and I actually really did have a great time. This was a genre that I made a goal to try to read more in 2022 because it's not one that I often dip my toes into. I'm just very hesitant when it comes to genres that I don't really have much familiarity with, because I don't know which tropes I like, which ones I don't like, what I'm personally comfortable with. And so I'm very fortunate that I found the books that really did work for me. And what was so helpful was that this book in particular was recommended to me by a bookseller. So I entered a bookstore at one point, I believe it must have been this year. So this was a new purchase for me. And I was picking up Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. That was a horror book that I did a lot of research on. It's dystopian in nature, and it has a lot of queer and feminist themes, mainly because the author is a trans woman. Part of my apprehension about that genre is the fact that it's typically male dominated. A lot of times queer characters are demonized, or they are the monsters themselves, and women's bodies are often mutilated and put into painful situations simply to sensationalize that pain, to add to that shock factor. So I had a lot of apprehension entering any type of book that is labeled horror. So I told this bookseller that, I explained to her why I was picking up Manhunt, and so she then led me to A Dowry of Blood. And this is actually a reimagining of Dracula, specifically from the perspective of one of his brides. In the book, her name is Constanza, and I ended up pairing this physical book with the audiobook from Libby, so I highly recommend that if you have access to it. It's very short, and it's written in epistolary form, in my opinion. It's part journal, because really Constanza is just documenting her life since reawakening as a vampire, the circumstances that led her to becoming a vampire to the point that Dracula changes her, and just simply the many centuries that go on since the beginning of her second life. And it's really fascinating because she actually never mentions the name Dracula in the entire book, because he names her. So this isn't a spoiler. At the beginning, she says that when he comes upon her, she's close to death, and then he places a name onto her and pretty much erases her past identity. So at the beginning of the book, she says, "Because you took my name, I refuse to put your name to pen," which I love that so much. The reason why I want to say it's epistolary is because she does address Dracula throughout, explaining to him her feelings during events, saying, "You were doing this while I was feeling this," etc. And I really like that format. because, I don't know, it was very intimate, and I really appreciated being a part of that, because when you're using second person POV, even if it's just addressing someone else, it's really impactful, and it is a very intimate experience and a chance, like a risk by the author to do that. So just awesome. On top of that, let me get into it. So basically, this is just a story of horror, but one when it comes to revenge and justice, especially because Constanza and her relationship with Dracula is just extremely unhealthy. He is a controlling partner. He manipulates her. He is condescending. He gaslights her. And it's honestly, that is a huge part of the horror elements, this fact of her constantly being in fear, questioning herself, and just being psychologically in her head. And she's not the only one. He has numerous lovers that he brings on and transforms into vampires so that it's kind of a part of his harem. All of them are really dependent on him in such an unhealthy way that it's really interesting to see in the format of what could arguably be a modern classic, since it is written in the gothic horror form that reminds me of Frankenstein. I haven't actually read the original Dracula, so I can't speak on that, but my friend Phoebe thought it was very boring. So I don't think I'll ever actually try it because I already have a hard time with classics, but this is amazing for those who are interested in classics or those who really aren't, but want to kind of, again, dip their toes in the water of classics. Just great. And I have to highlight the dedication at the front. S.T. Gibson says that this book is to those who escaped a love like death and to those still caught in its grasp. You are the heroes of this story. This is just such a brilliant, brilliant book. I honestly wish that more horror books went like this, especially because part of the tension is the fact that we know what is coming in the end. In one of the first few letters, she pretty much tells Dracula, I am putting to paper the reasons for why I eventually killed you after centuries of being with you. And it's just, oh my gosh, so great. I can't recommend it enough. Again, I'm not really a horror reader, but I really did love this. And I would love if anyone who is more knowledgeable in horror, if this sounds like anything else and you think I would like this, please comment below so that I can check it out when it comes to my choices for horror in 2023. I read a lot of mystery. I have read probably a third of the books that I read this past year were mysteries, and that's somewhere in the 30s. So instead of just discussing my favorite mystery book of 2022, I've decided to focus on a couple subgenres, and one of those subgenres is going to be Golden Age detective fiction. That was my most common subgenre within mystery to read, and I am clumping American and British together just because it makes sense for me. So my favorite out of that particular subgenre and time period is Craig Rice's The Wrong Murder. So this is a 1980s edition, and honestly any edition by her is really tough to find. I have managed to collect a few. You can see those that are in white spines. Those are all Craig Rice books, and I've gone crazy this year, but totally worth it. So my first experience with Craig Rice was thanks to the Mysterious Bookshop. I have a subscription with them, and I ended up getting 8 Faces at 3 back at the beginning of 2022. Since then, I've read a couple more Craig Rice's, and they've never disappointed me, but this was certainly my favorite, and I only read it a couple months ago. I just adore her so much. She is so chaotic. She really embraces the fact that she was writing in the late 30s and throughout the 40s predominantly, and it's set in Chicago. It's really just a roaring time, and it's also a time that is just so particular if you're someone who really likes historical detail. For instance, the second book that I read was The Corpse Steps Out, that features a radio star, which is just something we don't have today. Meanwhile, The Wrong Murder discusses a lot of heirs, those who are simply famous because they're rich, and it's really fun. They're constantly having some type of party or powwow, and it really is kind of a group effort when it comes to the mystery itself. But basically, the reason why I just love Craig Rice so much is because she is chaotic. Her entire collection of books pretty much are focused on some wild thing happening and the characters just surprising each other as they try to figure out who actually did this crime or whatever's going on. So for this particular book, we have Jake Justice, and he pretty much is an agent to the stars. He's been featured in every book I've read by Craig Rice so far, and usually it's his clients that end up getting into some mess, whether they've been framed, whether they're at the wrong place at the wrong time, and he pretty much has to get his friend, John J. Malone, who is a defense attorney, to help him figure out what actually happened. But this time, Jake Justice gets himself into trouble on his own because he is discussing the idea of murder with a guest at a party, and she claims that she would be able to kill someone and get away with it. She thinks that she would be able to do it and have the police never know she did it. And because they're drinking, because, you know, the drinks are flowing, he bets her that he would be able to prove it was her. And so they shake on it. They end up deciding what each person would win if this bet ever comes to fruition. And then the drunken night ends up being forgotten the next day immediately until there is this random murder that jars Jake, and he's thinking, I think she did it. And let me see if I can get her name. Mona. Yeah, so Mona had been everywhere, done everything. Well, not quite everything. She had never taken a human life and wanted to know what it would be like. What's more, she thought she could get away with it. Of course, no one at the party took her seriously, certainly not Jake Justice, at whose wedding reception this discussion was taking place. So that pretty much sets us up. And so now it's the race to figure out, how is this dead body in public on one of the busiest streets in Chicago connected to Mona, and how can he prove this? Because a lot is writing on this, especially what he would win, which is pretty much financial security. And it's just, it was just so good. They're just insane. All of the characters are crazy, and I absolutely adore it. And these editions are actually also just great as well. I have listened to this on audiobook as well, and the voice actors do a great job too. So if you are looking for a book that is very much set in its time, a mystery that is just super fun and, like, honestly ridiculous to a point, but in the best way because the characters are just very self-referential and they acknowledge that their lives are crazy, then I recommend this for you. The Wrong Murder by Craig Rice. And if you wanted to go in order, the first book that features John J. Malone, Jake Justice, and the rest of their Scooby gang, it goes 8 Faces at 3, The Corpse Steps Out, and then The Wrong Murder. And also, I haven't read this yet, but apparently book 4 is kind of a follow-up. They don't fully intersect with each other, but it is called The Right Murder, and I can't wait for it. So while I'm a huge mystery reader, I do tend to avoid cozy mysteries. It's an area that I'm just not familiar with. So in the past, what I've done is just read what I know, what I'm comfortable with. And 2022, I decided to change that. So I read quite a few modern cozy mysteries that I just usually wouldn't read. And I ended up finding some really great stories. My favorite one ended up being Buried in a Good Book by Tamara Berry. This is the first in the By the Book series, and since then I have read the second book in the series, On Spine of Death, which I think technically doesn't come out until January, or maybe it came out in December. I ended up getting a NetGalley arc for it. It's just such a fun series. Obviously it's perfect for bibliophiles because this is a biblio mystery series. The main character is Tess. She is a thriller writer. Not only that, she is a method writer, so she usually puts herself in some obscure situations just to see the plausibility of them before she then places them in her own books. She's a really great best-selling author, and a deadline is coming, and she is finding herself in kind of a jam. So what does she do? She takes her daughter Gertrude out of Seattle. They end up going to this cabin that was once owned by her grandfather, and there's no running water, there is no electricity, or at least there's no Wi-Fi, and they are just out there in the middle of nowhere in Winthrop, Washington, a very small town, while she tries to gain inspiration from it. Very soon into the book, they end up discovering a dead body, but interestingly, this dead body is falling from the sky because there is dynamite fishing going on nearby, and just body parts begin to rain all over Tess and her daughter Gertrude. So they end up literally becoming in the middle of this investigation. They're trying to figure out what happened. This happened on their land, and this is great inspiration for Tess, and it's also a great distraction. So she ends up becoming very much involved, and it's a really fun time. I'm not surprised I enjoyed this so much, mainly because it reminds me of a modernized Craig Rice novel, just because of the chaos that ensues. There is also a grumpy sunshine romantic subplot in here, and it just gets better in book 2 between Tess and the main detective, or I guess sheriff. I can't even remember his name. I should look it up. It literally doesn't say it. But what's funny is that he looks and kind of sounds just like the detective in her series, and he's also a fan of hers, though he hates to admit it. So there's a lot of great craziness in it, and the reveal at the end of this one in particular is just honestly so wild. But at that point I was already on the train and I was ready for anything, so I totally recommend it, especially if you like a few absurd subplots going on that end up intertwining at the very end. So yeah, very much recommend Buried in a Good Book. This was my favorite cozy mystery of 2022. My favorite fantasy book this year ended up being a YA book as well, which is just something that really fascinates me because I don't tend to read YA very often. Not because I'm an adult and I think adults shouldn't read YA, because I'm also an adult who absolutely adores reading middle grade, but I am just really pleasantly surprised that taking chances really worked out for me in 2022, and this is just a testament to that. So my favorite fantasy ended up being Small Favors by Aaron A. Craig, and this is a standalone fantasy. I don't think that's super common, whether it be YA or adult fantasy, to be honest, and it's just so satisfying. It's a dark fantasy that involves fairy tale elements, including a kind of retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, which I just really appreciated, and it throws in a lot of thriller suspense elements too, because a huge plot device is just community paranoia, which really impacted me so much in the best ways. I was so invested in this community, especially because this community is so dependent on working together to be successful, to thrive in a demanding environment that most people couldn't really handle living in isolation. So it's an excluded community called Amity Falls, and they're surrounded by woods that are supposedly filled with dark ancient creatures. And so people are very much dependent on each other. Everyone knows each other, and they're dependent on the supply runs that they make periodically throughout the year, especially the last one before winter settles in, because there's no way that they will be able to make the trek to the closest major city to get supplies, tools, food, medicine, and the like. And so the most recent supply run ends up becoming a disaster. There are no survivors. They are destroyed, torn apart, and so the community doesn't really understand what's going on. Have the creatures returned? Can they risk making another supply run? What's going on? And so Ellery and her family are just in dire straits. Ellery's parents end up leaving for the city for different reasons, that just for health. And so Ellery, being, the oldest with her twin brother, they become in charge. They need to take care of their youngest siblings and survive the winter so that when their parents return, everything can kind of come back to normal. But again, paranoia begins to rise in this community. You realize you can't really trust your neighbors, and you begin to wonder if you can trust yourself. Strange things are happening. Things are being sabotaged. Strangers are coming to town, and some seem to be noticing this while others are completely oblivious. It's really chaos in the best way. I think I've been saying chaos a lot this video, but I love chaotic reads because you just can't be sure what's happening next, and it just goes to show you that twists can be super useful across many genres, if we're being honest. But yeah, I highly recommend this. It also includes like a dark romantic subplot because one of the strangers who comes to town ends up gaining the interest of Ellery, and she gains his interest as well. And so yeah, it's just it's so good. I highly recommend it. I ended up reading this as a library book. I also listened to the audiobook at the same time, now that I think about it, And because I adored it so much, I did end up buying a secondhand copy, and it's actually in a great condition. So Pango Books, check it out. It's a really great resource, especially if you want to get books for a cheaper price that have just been lightly loved by other readers. For complete transparency, I actually haven't read many books in this genre this year. It probably does technically fit as a subgenre under fantasy, but I wanted to talk about it. It was so good. I'm so excited for book 2, which I'm pretty sure comes out this January, and that book is In Every Generation by Kendare Blake. Interestingly, this is also a YA book, so 2 YAs have become my favorites within their specific genres, which is just really interesting. And this one is pretty much a Buffy 2.0. We have Frankie, who is a witch, but after a major event, she ends up realizing that she also is developing the same type of abilities that are only associated with vampire slayers. So she's wondering what's going on. Is she some type of hybrid? And she begins to kind of collect her own Scooby gang between her new generation and those before her. For instance, Spike, Willow, pretty much all of those who are remembered and well loved from the Buffy franchise have kind of returned, and they're older, they're wiser, they are passing on their knowledge to Frankie and her friends. And I was nervous going into it because I didn't know how much I needed to know when it came to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I actually only had familiarity with Angel, the spin-off series, but Kendare Blake does such a good job making sure that fans who have just always adored Buffy are satisfied with metafictional kind of throwback references, as well as keeping new fans intrigued and informed about what relationships are going down, what history has been involved in this entire world, this realm of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so I really enjoyed it. It was super funny. It had the same type of kind of quippy humor that Buffy the Vampire Slayer had, and I really liked it. I thought that it was such a fun read, that the characters were genuine but also very humorous. Their dialogue, their dynamic was great, and I am really excited for book 2, so that's why I wanted to highlight it. So cool. This was also a library book that I just loved so much that I ended up getting a copy myself, and I got it through Pango Books. So again, check it out if you are looking for some really nice condition secondhand books for a good price. I have decided to highlight hard-boiled detective fiction because it's honestly a genre that I typically hate. I have only found one book that I really adore, and it happened to be this one I'm about to talk about, and that is Pleasantville by Attica Locke. I think that the factors involved with me adoring it is, one, because it's a modern read. It was just published, I want to say, in maybe 2016, 2015, and it's written by a Black woman. So I feel like all of those are indicative for why I adored this compared to hard-boiled, more classic detective fiction that was published in like the early to mid 20th century, because those tend to have a lot of problematic, just outdated and archaic beliefs and activities going on that I just can't get behind, and I can't thoroughly enjoy the novel. Every time it jars me and takes me out of the narrative, but this one doesn't. So I highly recommend it. It has so many important modern themes. I have to preface this by saying that I probably would have never picked up this book if it wasn't a required reading for one of my grad school classes. I was taking multicultural environmental literature this year, and this was the final book we talked about. So why was a hard-boiled narrative in such a kind of environmental, multicultural focused class? Well, it's because of the many themes that exist. We have voting rights, we have environmental racism, we have just the simple crime and media monopoly that exists when it comes to which communities' crimes get highlighted and get the justice they deserve and which ones don't. And I just loved it so much. So our main character, Jay, he's a lawyer, and I feel like he shares many aspects of the typical hard-boiled detective, but one aspect he doesn't share is that he actually does have a family. His wife recently passed after an illness, and so now he's raising his 2 children without her. He's really struggling, and his very successful law firm where, well, I guess it's not a law firm, just a law office, where he mainly focused on environmental injustice. He has seen better days. He's kind of over. He's ready to simply not fight as hard as he did in the past and get settlements where he can. But while he's kind of struggling with his own issues, some certain cases that aren't fully done yet, there is a missing young Black woman in the community of Pleasantville, which is a real community in Houston, which is just so crazy and so interesting. I love the idea of her focusing a lot of issues that are genuinely happening in a real life place. And Pleasantville is a predominantly historically Black community known for its voting power. And so this missing girl is connected with two other young Black women who were in the same community who went missing and were eventually found killed. And so we're talking about potentially a serial killer. And while all this is going on, there is a mayoral race for the next mayor of Houston. And it's just totally very much involved in like political, deep-seated corruption going on, the fact that certain voices are not being heard, that Jay doesn't really know who to trust, that some people are more trustworthy than others, but literally everyone has something to hide. So it's a really compelling read that features a lot of modern current issues. Obviously it was only published in 2015, so that's not surprising, but I recommend it so much. It is important to note that there is a book that comes before it in the series, and it's called Blackwater Rising. I think so, and I haven't personally read that, and Attica Locke does provide a significant amount of exposition so that we kind of understand the events going on in the first book, and it didn't impact me at all. But if you are interested in that, then please, yeah, read that first. Let me know if I should read it, and then go ahead and read Pleasantville, because yeah, it was so good. And unsurprisingly, it was my favorite hard-boiled narrative this year because I hate all the other ones. Yay! I can't emphasize enough how important it is to know that middle grade can be read at any level. For adult readers, young readers, they can be so fun, so insightful, so complicated and complex, and just brilliant that many of the middle grades that I read this year ended up receiving 5 stars, and I can't wait to eventually read them again in the future. But probably my favorite one, I would have to say, is Wonderscape by Jennifer Bell. And honestly, I read the second book in this series, Legendarium, which just came out in 2022 as well, and both of them received 5 stars. The only reason why I'm highlighting Wonderscape is simply because it's the first in the series, but both are so good. I hope that the series continues because I want to return to these characters and the very, very intricate and vivid world that Belle creates. So the main characters are Arthur, Ren, and Cecily. They're all very different. They come from very different walks of life. So typically you wouldn't really view them as friends. They aren't friends at the beginning of the book, but they end up somehow, because of certain circumstances, coming together. They end up being in the right place at the right time. But for them, in the moment, they think it's the wrong place and the wrong time. And they get sucked into this portal that takes them to a very futuristic society where instead of virtual reality games, the new fad is in real life reality games where they are actually participating on adventures. It is dangerous potentially to participate in these games. So the only way to return to their own time is to actually play in the different realms, successfully meet the heroes that are kind of, there's a hero attached to every single realm. And these heroes end up being historical figures. Just the historical figures that Jennifer Bell picks are brilliant. She makes sure to provide diversity within the characters themselves. Arthur, Ren, and Cecily are very diverse and very different. So are the historical figures. I was just so pleased, and I really can't wait to keep reading in this series. Return to Wonderscape, read Legendarium again, and whatever adventures these characters go on, because it's just amazing. The book itself, obviously the cover is gorgeous. I can totally imagine middle grade readers especially just being shaped by this book, and it's really heartwarming to know that books like this exist for escapist reasons, for simply teaching certain important lessons, appreciating the existence of history, of learning from mistakes, of learning how to support other people while they support you, found friendship, just the list goes on. This was such a good book. I can't enough recommend it. Please, please, please read it, especially if you're someone who wants to try out middle grade but you don't know where to start. This one is great. You know what's crazy is that while mysteries were obviously my most read genre, my second most read genre ended up being romance, which I would say is equivalent to horror and classics when it comes to my familiarity with it. And so romance was another genre that I really wanted to try more of. I was baffled that I ended up reading 10 books. That's about a tenth of what I read this year. To be honest, most of them didn't end up really being my cup of tea. I am still really testing out which tropes I like, which ones I don't, what type of tone I like, how spicy I like it, and just how dramatic I can handle it without, completely leaving the bounds of reality to the side. I think I was very hopeful because I absolutely had such a blast with The Cheat Sheet by Sarah Adams. That was such a fun book. I think that was my first romance of 2022, and that's what sparked my interest of trying to find a book that I really liked. I gave that one 4 stars, and so I was really gunning for a 5-star read. I'm like, please let me find a romance that I just can't put down, that I adore, that I could see myself returning to, and it just didn't really happen until book number 96 out of the 96 books I read. Yes, the final book I read in 2022 ended up being my favorite romance, and that was The Secret Bridesmaid by Katie Birchall. I can't even believe how serendipitous it is that I even found this book. I was returning home for the holidays to my family homestead, and I ended up stopping at this bookstore in Williamsport, Auto Bookstore. Absolutely recommend it. It's such a nice indie bookstore, and just the layout is great. And I usually just stop there to peruse. I don't often buy books. So I was looking at the romances, trying to see if there's something that I would want or that would catch my eye. The Secret Bridesmaid was one that I'd never heard of. It also just came out in 2021, so it's not surprising. I'm not really up to date on new releases. So I was thinking, I'm like, oh, should I buy it? Should I take the risk? It's kind of scary, especially when obviously I haven't had much luck when it comes to romances this year or in general. So I was kind of apprehensive. And then I checked my library apps. I always do this when I'm in a bookstore to see if I actually can get access to it through a library first. And then of course, if I love it, I can buy it later, as a few of the books I've discussed have already proven that. So I ended up discovering that the audiobook was available and ready to borrow immediately from Libby. And so I did that, and I ended up listening to the audiobook in the last few days of 2022, and I was enamored. It is such a fun, very humorous, like genuinely, if you talk about rom-coms as a film, this is the epitome of a film rom-com because there's so much humor. In honestly, the reason why some of the kind of ridiculous, over-the-top silliness events that went on, the reason why I was actually okay with it was because there was always a voice of reason. Like some character would acknowledge the fact that this was odd, like something weird was happening, and everyone was just kind of going with the flow with it. And many times the main character was that person, and I think that's so important. I can't really fully connect with a main character who can't be self-referential, especially when absurd things are happening around her. So Sophie was a great main character. She is pretty much a wedding planner, but what she actually is, obviously from what you can tell by the title, is that she's a secret bridesmaid. She gets hired by brides and sometimes grooms as a couple to help them manage the stresses and enjoy the process of preparing for a wedding without having to give away too much control in their opinion to an actual official wedding planner. Katie has been super successful in her recent career change. It's mainly been fueled by the fact that she's just been focusing on her career so much, because before becoming the secret bridesmaid, she was in an 8-year relationship and it ended quite poorly. The guy was a dick and I can't emphasize that enough. I am totally for self-growth, self-confidence, realizing that you are enough, and that is while this is a romance, clearly that is the focus on Sophie's journey, is realizing that she's enough because her boyfriend made her feel like shit, and he just didn't really seem like, he was a self-centered person who just really wanted to focus on himself and wanted to kind of put her down, keep her in the shadows so that he could be the center of attention all the time. So he was horrible. Anyway, this very high profile wedding ends up coming up, and she gets hired to be a secret bridesmaid, but it's a bit of a quasi situation because the bride didn't hire her. It was actually the bride's mother, because this is a royal kind of wedding, like super high society event, and the bride is, you know, viewed as high maintenance. She cannot get along with anyone, and so she's just pretty much a bridezilla in a sense, but like in real life. Meanwhile, the bride in question has a brother who obviously ends up kind of getting closer with Sophie. They're filling each other out. But during this entire event, Sophie is not Sophie. She has to have a completely secret identity. So she's got a different name so that the press and everyone else don't really look into her, and it doesn't ruin her entire career as a secret bridesmaid if, you know, the paparazzi and everyone show who she is. And so she has to lie about her identity to this guy that she really likes, Tom, who is Cordelia, the bride's brother. And okay, so I really did love the romance. Sophie and Tom just had this really kind of natural, not forced attraction, and it seemed to be paced appropriately, in my opinion. But even more so, I really was more invested almost in Cordelia and Sophie's growing friendship. Both of them needed to gain trust. Both of them needed to like trust themselves and trust each other when it came to friendship and just respect and responsibility. And that's honestly was what I was mainly invested in. So I don't know if that really makes sense that this was my favorite romance and the romance wasn't my favorite part, but you know what? A win is a win, a 5-star is a 5-star, and that's exactly what I gave this book. The Secret Bridesmaid by Katie Birchall got 5 stars for me. I saw that she recently came out with another kind of wedding-themed romance this past year, and so if I can find that book from the library, I will 100% be reading it. And with that said, the next time I end up stumbling upon The Secret Bridesmaid, a physical book copy, I will be buying it. Can't wait. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. If you're still watching, I really appreciate you. I hope you had fun. I hope that a few of these books, if you haven't read them, have made it onto your 2023 TBR list. If you have read them and you have your own thoughts, please comment below. Let me know what your own picks were for these genre categories, or for genre categories I didn't even cover. And I can't think of anything else. So like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell in whatever order you want to do it in. And I hope you have a lovely 2023 reading season. Bye!